I'll take it.
Who's going to be presenting on mishap exercise design through the lens of a gamer.
All right, so as you mentioned, my name is Staff Sergeant Milburn. I'm going to be presenting to you on mishap exercise design through the lens of a gamer. As a quick disclaimer, I have no financial obligations. All my research comes from open source, and my views, opinions, and designs that will show up here are entirely my own. All right, so I'm going to start off. This is Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild Switch. Why am I bringing this up at the very beginning of my presentation? Well, when they were designing Breath of the Wild, their alpha build was they took the map of Kyoto, overlaid Hyrule Castle with Kyoto Imperial Castle, that's the little green square that you see there, and then they layered every single location of that game into a real-life location. So Rito Village is the Arashiyama Bamboo Forest. This has been one of Nintendo's best-selling games in the past decade. What this shows us is that when we take an abstract idea, something that is so completely foreign and different from what we are trying to get to our final product, we will end up having a better final product once we layer that product back on top of it. So starting from a very, very basic level, we're going to be looking at where is our current design philosophy behind exercises and trainings. I'm going to show a couple of reconceptualizations of an individual skill training, a larger field skill type training, and then I'm going to go into how you would design a campaign, aka an exercise, from gaming using gaming lexicons. So, starting off, our current history is for game design is roughly stuck in the 1970s, where you have your theme of your dungeon. Each room is going to fit the theme of that dungeon, and you are just trying to beat the room of that dungeon before you can move on to the next one. I'm going to commit a cardinal sin. Gary Gygax was terrible at designing an adventure. He could write a good event, he could write a good encounter, he could write a good puzzle, but he cannot write a good story. Why? Because all we are doing is teaching to a test. All we need to do is beat this room to then go on to beat the next room. There is no kind of lateral or longitudinal thinking in how to get through the dungeon. Moreover, it's completely disconnected from the overall story, so we don't care. And that's not what we want to see in a learning environment. And most importantly, that was failed to be done in a lot of these other adventures that he wrote, was that there was no actual playtesting of the adventure. So when you don't play test, you don't see where is your breaking point, you don't see where your design fails. So when we are trying to gamify a learning concept, we need to look at first, what is the skill that we are critically trying to teach? Then we need to determine what is going to be our engagement factor. How do you pull somebody in to that learning concept that you're trying to give to them? And then most importantly, once we figured that out, we need to make sure that the mechanics themselves can function on their own. So we'll look at a very simple skill, drawing a map. The modality that we're going to be using here, the methodology we're going to be using is a difference in kind recognition. So a D8 kind of looks like a D4 or a D10, and every player, the first time they're picking it up, will mistake a D20 for a D12. This is what we're going to be using, recognizing that difference in kind. So we're going to teach them first up, okay, here's where you're going to draw your map. You need to draw out in your legend field what symbol are you going to recognize for each dice. We also need to recognize, hey, what is each square going to represent on our field? If you don't have one battle map like I do or most other gamers do, just take some wrapping paper, flip it over. Nice 1-inch squares all around. So 1 square equals 1 square on there. Each player is going to be given a certain sector that they'll covering, say A through H, I through P, and they will be reporting back to your cartographer, who's going to be sitting off to the side. He's not going to be looking at this field that's there. What they're going to be doing is just writing down those notes of what they put in their legend, which dice is in what field. And then we're going to layer on a difficulty to it next tier up. So this is one that we did with mine, where I've increased the difficulty in kind. So a regular boy will look different from a commando, looks different from a shooter and a big shooter, and you have to go all the way down that field, marking down what is in each square. If this is starting to sound like a mishap investigation and looking at what is a debris field, congratulations, you're absolutely right, because when you add in that final layer, you take away the map, you take away the training wheels. Now they have to actually physically take a ruler, measure things out, and plot it out. But this entire time, they don't realize that they're learning how to do a mishap investigation. They just think they're playing a game drawing a map. So next up, I'm going to move on to something a little more complex. How do you deal with a larger scale, working with a whole bunch of people all over the place? And this is going to then get us into thinking about what is our asset management while in the field, using turn-based. Every single action that you're going to be able to take in this game is, here's the number of rounds it takes, here's how many people it's going to take. This is where we get into the concept of a sustained action. How long, it's like what happens when you're actually doing an action that takes more than one round. Each of your classes is going to have a set number of actions that they're allowed to perform. Your technician can do one thing, your docs can do another. And then we actually layer on, here's the exercise. You've got a mass casualty, and you have to flip every single one of those little black tiles that's there over to find out what they are. You need to triage them, you need to triage them, treat them, transport them, get them on out of that field. One problem, patients will die. So if you don't triage and transport them fast enough, they die. You lose that part of the game. For the first round, everyone's like, oh yeah, it's not a problem, it's just a game, it's just a game. Until you get into that aspect of, hey, you're sustaining an action, you can't do anything this round. At which point you now get into that mindset of, oh, I now have to think about what action I'm going to do very carefully in order to manage all of my assets in the field. This is what I used to teach 2 of my flight surgeons how to run a mass casualty field 1 week before we had a massive exercise. So now we're going to go on to we've looked at an individual skill, we're now going to start looking at more of a grand campaign design. Because a military exercise is a LARP, a live action role play. We take a class, we put on a fancy set of guard, and we go out and play. And when we're designing it, the number of encounters we have is going to determine the length and difficulty of our exercise. Getting into some basic lexicon, we refer to player characters as PCs. Non-player characters, these are ones that are just given your little cards. They're going to be moulaged up. They're just going to follow a set of instructions. And your GM is the one who is controlling the game overall. As I mentioned before, types of actions. An immediate action is one that you start and you take immediately, takes effect. A sustained action, I will start that action, but then it carries on for a couple of rounds. It may carry on for a couple of minutes or even an hour. And while I am sustaining that action, I can't do anything else but sustain the action. And then a ready action would be, okay, I'm going to wait for something to happen. So I'm going to wait for my colleagues over here to hold up the 5-minute sign to realize I must hurry up. That is my ready action. And the hardest part to get around is with our encounter design is balancing our action economy and our difficulty class. The more actions we put into our encounter, the more difficult it's going to become. Because in order to beat that encounter, you need to have a certain number of actions completed. But if you put too many of them in there, it becomes nearly impossible to complete. And as I mentioned before, at the very beginning, how certain encounters are not chained into each other. Well, modern game design has gone into this concept of we are going to chain our encounters into each other, but we can also make them modular in such a way that will continue with our flow of the story that we're trying to do. The chart here on the right of the screen comes from the Waterdeep Dragon Heist adventure, where you pick what style you're going to do, like who is going to be your bad guy, and then it runs you through 10 different possible chains of events. But there's only 8 per chain, and that's how you plug and play, and that's how you swap things around. So let's look at what an actual exercise would look at. There we go, we need to hurry up. Here's our 3 major encounters. We got a pilot reintegration, securing a site, ground crew interviews. But we don't have actual pilots at our base. We don't have any real securing of a site. Cool. We're just going to move on right from there then. We're going to grade out those encounters. We're going to give our players a little bit of a feedback saying, hey, here's what happened previously. Now we're going to go to it. So that means we're just going to be focusing on the ground interview section. And our skill checks that we need to do it is we're going to need to sequester all of our members, secure the records, draw the labs, conduct our interviews. Let's take a look at drawing the labs. That's an immediate action plus a sustained action. The immediate action is just drawing up the lab, and the sustained action is processing all of those labs. Now, what happens if you bring 30 people in? Okay, well, 10 minutes per patient to draw a lab, start to finish, plus times 30 patients, that's 5 man-hours. That is the timeline and the time frame that we have to do that. If we don't have 5 hours to do this exercise, unfortunately, you've just made your difficulty class of that encounter too difficult to complete. It will fail. this is where our action economy comes into place. So to wrap up, we need to, when we're thinking of our training, we want to focus on what are we looking at, single skill versus multitask versus full-blown campaign. We want to find where is our cognitive disconnect before we actually bring things out into the field. And most importantly, we want to fail in our exercise design. We want to fail hard and we want to fail fast. Because when you break your game, that's when you find where everything comes together, that's where you find your holes, and that's where you're going to truly find the nugget of your educational experience. The only thing I have left to say is, how would you like to do this? Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions, if anyone has a question.
Hi, just one. Closed world or open world, and which would you use under what kind of training scenarios or training goals?
It depends on what it is. Honestly, if you're just dealing with a tabletop or if it's just inside of a small thing, much like I had mentioned at the last, it would be more of a you're dealing with a closed world, so you're just having your own little scenario within your unit. But once you go to, say, a mass base-wide exercise, that's when you're taking on the concept of an open world design, where things are, multiple incidents are happening around your base. So you need to think of what is going on all over the place. You will need multiple GMs for something like that, aka your multiple WIT members. And those multiple WIT members need to be talking to each other, because if they're not talking to each other, much like at anyone who's ever gone to a gaming convention and running multiple tables, you will always have GMs bouncing back and forth between the tables where individual members are playing versus back to a central table where the grand GM is running the campaign, so that there is a constant flow of that information to make sure that the campaign functions correctly. Otherwise, it will break down when you're in that open world scenario.
So limit the side quests is what you're saying.
Yes, side quests in exercises tend to happen when your WIT does not talk to each other.
Any other questions? No?
Thank you.